Well, good afternoon, everybody. We're just a few seconds away from starting at 1 o'clock. We'll just allow everybody to join us in the audience, both on Zoom and on YouTube, and then we'll get started. Great, so I make that 1 o'clock by my clock here at the Wallace Collection. So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Wallace Collection online, and welcome to today's talk, Dogs in French 18th Century Decorative Arts, with our Curatorial Assistant Félix Zorzo, and we're delighted also to be joined today by Dr. Mia Jackson from Waddesdon Manor. I'll be handing over to both of our speakers in just a few moments' time, but as always, there's a little bit of boring housekeeping just to get started. So first of all, to mention, if you're having any difficulties, either on YouTube or with Zoom, do just drop us a message, either via the Q&A on Zoom or via the chat function on YouTube. If you're having difficulties with either of those functions, just pop us a message at learning@wallaccollection.org, and we'll do our best to get back to you as quickly as possible. You can also use the Q&A function and the chat function to send in any questions or comments you may have for today's speakers. So please do get those through, as we'll have a little bit of time at the end just to run through any questions. Also, the session will be recorded, so if you do miss anything, don't worry, you can always catch up a little further down the line. And finally, just to mention that both on YouTube and Zoom, there are captions for today's talk, live captions. So if you do need those on Zoom, just select the CC button and choose your preference at the bottom of your screen. Otherwise, on YouTube, you should receive captions as standard. So, as I said, all that boring business out the way, please allow me to hand over to Felix and Mia for today's talk. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Ollie, for this kind introduction, and welcome everyone to this talk where we are going to be discussing the myriads of ways in which artists, designers, patrons express their love for their canine friends and how they represented them in the French 18th century decorative arts. It could be modeled in bronze, in porcelain, painted in enamels, in porcelain, even woven in tapestries. Today, I am accompanied by a good friend and a very good colleague, Dr. Mia Jackson, Curator of Decorative Arts at the National Trust's Waddesdon Manor, who has a particular interest in studying animals represented in French 18th century decorative arts, especially bats and monkeys. And Mia also has a particular love for dogs, and she has two adorable Jack Russells, Pixie and Kiki, who may do a guest appearance later on, so don't be surprised if you see them. Welcome, Mia, and it's an absolute pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much, Felix, for inviting me to come and talk with you about our pet subject.
Fantastic. So this is going to be some kind of conversation, and you know that the subject is dogs in French 18th century decorative arts, but how this came about. So about a year ago, I was preparing or starting to prepare a paper for a conference where I was looking at some paintings by the French painter François de Porte, who is represented in the Wallace collection and who was collected by one of our founders, the fourth Marquess of Hertford, and how some of these paintings were in his collection. And then I saw that some of these representations of animals, and in particular dogs, were also appeared in other media, in particular in the Sèvres cup and saucer that we will be looking at it later, and the saucer that we have here, although must say right now that this is not after the book, but we will get to that in a minute. And I also thought that it was a very happy coincidence to talk about dogs in French 18th century decorative arts, while we have our very successful exhibition, Faithful and Fearless, Portraits of Dogs from Gainsborough to Hogney, which is open at the Wallace Collection until the 15th of October. So if you haven't visited, please do come and visit. So let's start with our subject, and just to give a brief introduction of the representation of dogs in art. They have been, dogs, we know that they have been alongside humans for millennia. They appear represented since antiquity in art. but it's really in the Middle Ages and towards the Middle Ages that they are being represented in a more favorable way in art. Actually, by coincidence, I was listening to a podcast this morning in which the great historian Michel Pastoureau was mentioning the promotion of dogs throughout the Middle Ages. And they start appearing as symbols of fidelity in funerary monuments, like the one we see here. And then by the beginning of the modern era, so towards the 16th century, they appear in the representation in portraits of great figures of the time. And we see here how Charles V would have wanted to be represented with this strong and imposing dog, because the qualities of one would have been taken by the other. But moving swiftly to the French 18th century, we see that dogs especially appear when we talk about decorative arts in relation to the hunt. And this is also quite interesting because it's the participation of dogs in this royal and princely pursuit that promotes the status of the dog throughout the European societies. And they are indispensable for the hunt, and the hunt is indispensable for accessing the status of a patron. They are also usually associated to food and dining, so the decoration of dining rooms, because game is probably it's synonymous of fine dining during the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. And in terms of chronology, so one of the most important patrons in the 15th century is Louis XV, and his passion for the hunt is related to his status, but it's also a family passion. Louis XIV, his predecessor, had a love for hunting, and Louis XV loved hunting so much that he was hunting on a weekly basis. When he spent time in Compiègne and Fontainebleau, he hunted on a daily basis, and this was translated into the decoration of his palaces, and this royal trend was, of course, imitated by the rest of society. Most of the times, as we said, these representations of the hunt are linked to these chateaus, these hunting lodges in the middle of lush forests where the hunt would have taken place, and this is very appropriate for the decoration of these pieces, of these residences. But sometimes they go a bit further. They have a more erudite connection, and this is through the inclusion, as we see here, of the myth of Diana the Huntress, and we see that she is accompanied by a lovely dog that we have here, still represented in a quite schematic way. This clock is attributed to the Paris-based Dutch cabinet maker Bernard van Ryssenberg, and is one of the clocks that cements this association between Diana and the hunt, and the decoration of clocks with bull marquetry furniture, bull marquetry decoration, during the first decades of the 18th century. And this association between hunting, Diana, and clocks is going to be quite influential, as we will see some years later in this model attributed to Charles Cresson. And Cresson is a very interesting character related to the French 18th century decorative arts, because he received a training as a sculptor, but then he was registered as a cabinet maker, and he created the models for his own gilt bronze mounts, and here they're quite exuberant in this clock. And he got into trouble for creating these models because the very strict gilt regulations forbade him from creating them, because he was trespassing on the cabinet making restrictions. And he was even fined on 3 occasions for this, although he seemed to have kept on doing it. What I wanted to show you here with this image is how incredibly detailed the representation of this hunt is, the height of the action, and you see this very lifelike dog with his coat that has been very detailedly chased, and it contrasts with the bristles of the boar, and this is due to a quite close observation of nature. But of course, this has a precedent, and we will hear from Mia about the precedent for this clock.
So this clock at Waddesdon is also attributed to Cresson, but is a little bit earlier than the one that Felix was talking about. I think it's fair to say that it is probably a precursor to the Wallace clock. The gilt bronze figure of Diana on top of the clock does not yet have her trusty hound, and nor does she have her bow and arrow. But as you can see, the hounds decorate the sides of the clock, which is veneered in buhl marquetry, and their presence helps us to identify this model as representing Cresson. But Cresson then go as representing Diana, but Cresson elaborates on this idea with the piece at the Wallace, adding the hunted as well as the dogs doing the hunting.
Yeah, thank you, Mia. And moving forward, we also see that another great designer, sculptor in his own right, because he was trained as a goldsmith, is Jean-Claude Chambellan Duplessis, who may have designed this clock at the Wallace collection. And we see here how the clock seems to be morphing into this oak tree, but also with flower branches around. And perched atop the clock, we see this spaniel that is also very lifelike. And we can't see really here in this photograph, but he's showing his teeth. He's about to accomplish the hunt of this pheasant. You even can see his claws, how he's getting onto the pheasant. And again, we see that there is a love for dogs, but also quite close, detailed study of them. And they are represented in a very lifelike manner. And Mia is going to tell us about more spaniels perched atop clocks.
So by the time of Louis XVI, dogs appear more infrequently in gilt bronze mounts on pieces of furniture. But this clock atop a filing cabinet that accompanies a desk at Waddesdon Manor is surmounted by two putti playing with a spaniel, which is a model that is attributed to the bronzier Etienne Matincourt. The putti playing with the spaniel may allude to the famous desk made for Louis XV by Urban and Riesner, which has a similar mount, not identical, but similar. But in this case, the Matincourt mount, the dog is very naturalistically rendered, its fur and ears expertly chased, and its fur contrasts beautifully with the smooth flesh of the putti and the billowing clouds below. Could I have the next slide, please, Felix? So dogs, of course, could also be depicted not only for their symbolic value or their association with the hunt, but simply as beloved pets. This pair of gilt bronze fire dogs, and the English word is suitably hilarious for a fire dog with a dog on it, might depict the pet dog and cat of the Prince de Condé. Geoffrey de Belague, in cataloguing Waddesdon's collection, associates them with an inventory description, the dog being named Président and the cat described as Angola, which we now call Angora cats. Similar dog and cat pairings of fire dogs exist in gilt bronze by the bronzier Philippe Caffieri, and were even copied as figures in porcelain. Interestingly enough, the Cri de Paris, so the depictions of the street sellers of Paris, accompanied by what they shouted to attract their customers, often show itinerant salesmen with poppies in their pockets and carrying a cat, and they shout, "Achetez mes petits chiens, buy my little dogs, mon bel Angola, my beautiful Angola," so the beautiful Angora cat. Have the next slide, please, Felix. So returning to the hunt, and moving on to 18th century French textiles, chiefly tapestries and carpets, we return to Mars and Diana with the Gobelin tapestry manufactory, which became an instrument of state under Colbert and Louis XIV, showcasing the brilliance of French decorative arts. In these panels, which are in the West Gallery at the East Gallery at Waddesdon, and set into the paneling of the walls. And I was up a step ladder yesterday trying to get a photograph of the one of Diana. So apologies for the bad quality of the photo. But we see Mars on the left with a cartouche below where a wolf is biting the throat of a dog. But on the right, we have Diana with her symbol of a crescent moon on her forehead, holding a spear and accompanied by a hunting dog. Below her is a stag's head trophy, and the whole ornamental edifice rises from a fountain with two dogs with their paws on the basin of the fountain. And it may remind you of the crescent clock that I showed you earlier, where the use of the arabesque, a decorative panel with narrative elements, is also turned into ornament. Some of those narrative elements become ornament, like those two dogs in this panel. Could I have the next slide, please, Felix? A similar, though more naturalistic version of these vertical decorative panels is to be seen on this amazing Savonnerie screen at Waddesdon. The Savonnerie carpet manufactory, and this is panels of carpet rather than tapestry, used designs by Alexandre François Desportes, who Felix mentioned earlier. These magnificent screens were usually reserved for members of the French royal family. And you can see the dogs on the right clamoring to reach the stag above them, and surmounted by a corde de chasse, a hunting horn, right at the top. And then I think you're going to talk about Oudry, aren't you, Felix, and Beauvais?
Yes, thank you, Mia, because we wanted to show you the three main manufacturers of tapestries in 18th century France. We've seen the Gobelin, Savonnerie, and now I'm showing you here some tapestries inserted into this chair frame. And they are from the Beauvais manufactory. And when we talk about Beauvais and the representation of animals, dogs in this case, we need to talk about Jean-Baptiste Oudry, who was probably the leading animal painter of the 18th century. And he worked for the Beauvais manufactory from 1726, and he even became director of the manufactory a few years later in 1734. Although Oudry kept on rising, and he also was associated to the Gobelin, and he became director of the Gobelin, and he produced a very famous, he produced cartoons for a very famous series of tapestries, which are the Hunts of Louis XV, and we will come back to those hunts later on. And Oudry, in a way, takes over the Porte, is of a generation or half a generation, depending on how you look at it, after the Porte. So once the Porte dies, Oudry virtually has no competition, and he becomes the lead animal painter. And here we see these two works in the Wallace collection, and apologies for having shown this exact slide in a previous talk, but I just couldn't leave it because it's perfect for our subject today. And we see this a dog that has been referred to in English as a spaniel, but in French it's been referred to as a chien barbé, a French water dog, which I think is probably more appropriate. You see its curly hair around the head, the ears, the tail, and it's probably a better description of this dog. And on the painting produced by Udry to the right, he's chasing these ducks, and then this has been flipped, which is usually the case when making tapestries, because they're looked, so they're kind of woven in reverse, and it's just the upper section or the front section of the dog that is included in this tapestry. Also, just to say that this dog, and as many others that we usually see represented in different media, they appear in many different compositions because the artist, either Udry or at the different manufacturers, they would have master sketch, so to speak, and then the same dog can appear chasing ducks, chasing hares, and you can sometimes identify the exact same animal in different positions, what tells us that the artist would have looked at them from different point of view. And Mia is going to tell us about the other great French artist who was fundamental for Beauvais and the decorations.
So Udry, when he was in charge of the Beauvais manufactory, also went on to commission François Boucher to supply cartoons or designs, life-size paintings that were later cut up and used as models for the tapestries, for larger tapestries at Beauvais. And this particular tapestry, which is in the dining room at Waddesdon, is part of a series known as La Noble Pastorale, or the Noble Pastoral. It was the last of the great tapestry series that Boucher designed for Beauvais, and parts of the original cartoons have been stuck back together again and have survived in 2 paintings at the Getty. The series shows a gentler idea of the countryside, the pastoral, than that typified by the hunt, in which shepherds and shepherdesses loll about in beautiful surroundings, flirting and picnicking, and littler dogs with ribbons. So you can see this dog prancing on its hind legs, and symbolic of affection and fun. So from the 1750s to the late 1770s, the Noble Pastoral was a great success. The series was woven no less than 15 times between 1755 and 1778, including 5 sets for Louis XV and 1 for the royal wardrobe. And now we're moving on to our mutual great love of Sèvres porcelain.
Thank you, Mia. Well, we've looked at gilt bronze and tapestries, and of course we need to move on to Vincennes Sèvres now, where we are both very lucky because both the Waddesdon Manor and the Wallace collection have really wonderful collections of Sèvres porcelain. And so we have great illustrations for you. And just as an introduction, so Vincennes Sèvres, there are a myriad of representations of animals in the reverse, so in these sort of panels that we find in tableware, in vases, also in plaques, but overwhelmingly they're usually birds. There are a few farm animals, especially when it's appropriate for the compositions, such as pastorals, and we have here this example with this pastoral scene with sheep. So sheep, sometimes goats, sometimes cows, they make an appearance. And then we also have other farm animals, such as chickens and sometimes foxes as well. Here, a fox in what is probably an armorial device, an armorial device, and sometimes foxes appear in fables, the representation of these tales. Animals could be modeled, like we see here, this hen and one of her 3 chicks atop of this perfume burner, an extima. And surprisingly, dogs are not that frequent when we compare them with other animals. And we will see a few examples of them, especially painted. but it is different when they are modeled. And Mia is going to tell us about some of these model dogs from Vincennes and Sèvres.
Thanks. So the earliest on this slide on the left dates from around 1753 and survives in this white example, which is in Australia, but there's also a naturalistically coloured version in the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge. The factory made many different sculptural models of dogs. Some may have been generic, but others might have been commissioned portraits, such as this one in the middle that is thought to depict Inez, Madame de Pompadour's dog, and with her fur naturalistically painted by the painter Charles Nicolas Daudin, and on a wonderful marquetry stand by the cabinet maker Leleu. It's thought that this particular dog on stand may have been commissioned by the Comte or Comtesse de Choiseul, who inherited Inez the dog after Madame de Pompadour's death in 1764. And little dogs are often used to evoke their owners, and the dog on the right has been said to represent the favourite dog of Queen Marie Antoinette. Can I have the next slide, please? Figures of dogs are also incorporated in Sèvres in many biscuit porcelain groups. So biscuit porcelain or unglazed porcelain was used in place of sugar sculpture to decorate the dessert table, and it's unglazed so that the detail is much crisper, and it looks more like marble or more like the crispness of sugar sculpture. Much of Sèvres' output was designed by François Boucher. So, for example, you can see bottom left a similar group to the one you saw in the Beauvais tapestry, but also by the later director of the sculpture studio, Falconet. And my favourite biscuit group, including a dog, is this marvellous little dog in the most luxurious 18th century French dress who's dancing for a treat. Could I have the next slide, please? So after Udry's death in 1755, the painter Jean-Jacques Bachelier received commissions such as decorating the dining room at the Château de Choisy, which was one of Louis XV's favourite hunting lodges. But in 1748, Bachelier was employed by the Vincennes manufactory to produce and acquire sketches that could be used by the porcelain painters. And until the mid 1750s, they're mainly floral or of birds. But by 1751, when Bachelier was appointed director artistique at the manufacture, he opened a school for training apprentice artists from Sèvres in the skills of decoration. And in 1759, after the purchase of the manufactory by Louis XV, he supervised the painter's workshop. But as well as the large-scale commissions, he also painted more domestic portraits of pet dogs, including Madame de Pompadour's dogs. And you can see Milady twice on the right, and on the left, a dog that you can see in the current exhibition at the Wallace collection, which is on loan from the Beaux Museum. We do not know whose dog this is, but it seems likely to have been a portrait commissioned of a pampered pooch, and you can see that the dog's just stolen its owner's slippers and is pleading for forgiveness next to its velvet upholstered bed. Could I have the next slide, please? So this porcelain plaque is part of a snuff box, and the snuff box is at Waddesdon Manor. It matches very closely the description of a snuff box sold by the luxury merchant Lazare Duvaux. Oh, there's Kiki. To Madame de Pompadour in 1758, although the gold mounts into which the 6 porcelain plaques are mounted are later. The 2 dogs on the top have been identified as Inez on the left and Mimi on the right. But in fact, for reasons I'm about to explain, I think that they are more likely to be a dog called Bibi and Mimi on the right. Mimi is immortalized in paint and in print by François Boucher and Christophe Huet, and also a printmaker called Fessard, as well as in prints made by Madame de Pompadour herself. The dog on the left, Bibi, was given to Madame de Pompadour in 1758 by the Prince de Soubise, and there's a rather charming diary reference by the Duc de Croix where he says that the Prince de Soubise was so happy to see him at dinner that he greeted him as if he was Bibi the dog. In his footnotes, he mentions that Bibi was a little barbette that Madame de Pompadour had been given by the Prince de Soubise and who had retained for him a great attachment. Madame de Pompadour also made a print of Bibi, and a portrait exists of her by Christophe Huet. The rest of the snuff box is made up of 5 more porcelain plaques mounted into these gold mounts, which show Madame de Pompadour's collection of exotic birds. And you can see that these 2 little dogs are very spoilt. You can see their collars, which have got golden bells, 3 golden bells each on them. And we know that because the orders survive for the velvet dog collars that Madame de Pompadour ordered from Lazare du Veau, and they had gold name tags. And they had Madame de Pompadour's symbol of 3 towers embroidered onto the velvet. And they cost between 134 and 212 livres, which is quite a lot of money. On to you, Felix, and another Angora cat.
Thank you, Mia. Well, it's quite incredible to see how spoiled those dogs were. But it's wonderful to know that we have documents to talk about them. And we are still staying with Bachelier, who, with his association with Sèvres, he may have designed, attributed this design of vase that includes these 3 animals. There is an eagle, an Angora cat at the top that gives the name to this vase, is known as an Angora or Angola vase, and also a dog. And it's a quite naturalistic dog for its size. And you can even see its fluffy coat that is being highlighted in gold, and his teeth are very, well, his or her teeth, its teeth are very sharp, and its expression is quite startled. Their 3 animals are full of movement, and they're quite dramatic. I also like how it adapts very well to the curved profile of this vase. It's a very clever adaptation, and I just wanted to show it alongside this painting of a cat, of an Angora cat by Bachelier. I think they just make a lovely pair, but you can see how Bachelier would have provided these models for in paint with the fluffy coats that then are being represented in porcelain. And just out of curiosity, there are only 2 vases, these Angora vases that we know of, and they're both at the Royal Collection. So moving on, this is the cup and saucer that originating this talk that we're giving today. And it's a Sèvres cup and saucer produced circa 1788. And it includes painting after the porte, as we mentioned, and also after a print, and we're going to study it in detail. But what is quite curious is that we know the name of the dog in the cup, and this dog is Nonette, a dog that belonged to Louis XIV. Nonette was part of Louis XIV's royal pack, La Mette Royale. And this was sort of an elite hunting pack very much cared for the king, and they specialized in hunting game of large size or in large quantities. So they were trained and cared for very with lots of detail. And the pride that Louis XIV took in this park is represented by a commission that he did to his animal painter, François Desportes, in 1702, to represent pairs of dogs or groups of dogs from his park to decorate the antechamber of his bedroom at Marly, one of his hunting lodges. And then in 1714, he asked Desportes to add some more paintings to this scheme. And this is when Nonnet came to be represented for Louis XIV. And we see it here. So we see the whole process of Desportes painting these dogs. He starts with these sketches from life as the ones at the top left. And we see Nonnet in 3 different positions. And then we see Nonnet and Zed, another dog from the royal pack. And then below we see a detailed oil sketch with its full colors of Nonnet. Then sometimes there is another intermediate stage, which is the dog set in the final scene. And then we see the final painting. They usually have this very similar composition, the dog on the foreground, a quite high horizon line, a clear sky, these landscapes to represent the places where the hunt would have taken place, and crucially, the name of the dog inscribed in gold letters. And this is what we see here. But quite clearly, as you may remember, this is not exactly the same representation of Nonnet that we have in our cup, because the representation of Nonnet in our cup is from a series of paintings and drawings that were done 3 years later. Nonnet originally belonged to the Marquis de Livry, one of Louis XIV's aides-de-camp, and probably inspired by this first commission from 1702 by Louis XIV to Desportes. Livry asked Desportes to represent his dogs and Nonnet as part of a decoration, a cycle of decoration for his hunting lodge. And this is when in 1711, Desportes represented Nonnet. And here we see 2 crucial stages as well. So, sorry, let me go back to the first live drawing that Desportes would have done of Nonnet, and is, you can see very detailed. She is attentively looking. You can really tell the presence of this dog, and then it's translated into a more detailed oil sketch that also may be kept as some kind of souvenir from the commission, and then is inserted in the final painting in a similar composition to the ones that he painted for Louis XIV. And sorry for the image, the black and white image, but the final painting is in an unknown location, so we can't really see the detail, but the collar of Nonnet is inscribed with "Je suis à Livry," I belonged to Livry, and the date 1711, which helps us date the painting that inspired our cup. And here I wanted to show you, what is quite crucial to understand how our Sèvres painter, Didier, came to see and came to get his hands on this composition is because in 17, let me just find the date for you. In 1784, the Comte d'Angivilliers, who was the cultural minister, so to speak, he decided to buy a set of paintings, drawings, sketches by François de Port from his nephew for the use of the manufactories. And in particular, he mentioned Sèvres. So this set of 50 paintings and over 700 sketches and drawings made their way to the Sèvres archives, where artists at Sèvres could take inspiration from. And this is when Didier came in contact with this drawing and sketches. And I particularly think that he may have looked at the oil sketch rather than the drawing, because the lustrous coat and the pose of the dog is depicted in a very similar way, even the weight of the color. And if we see the ripples of the coat that have their reflection here, they're almost picked here by Didier in his painting on the cup. I must say that then Livry gave this dog to Louis XIV, and that's why in 1714 Louis XIV added it to his set of paintings. And I just wanted to show you these two paintings at the Wallace collection that include other dogs. It would be tempting to say that either of these two spaniels is Nonette. It would be a lovely close circle, but I think that looking closely at the coats of these dogs, especially at this white on the the right side of this dog, probably means that it's not Nonette. And Didier, who joined the manufactory in 1787, he painted after these sketches from the book in several locations. And this is another composition from the Royal Collection, this jug. And you can see how he has adapted the dog hunting this duck into this reserve. This is painted on hard paste porcelain, so the technique is different. The colors are not mastered in the same way. They cannot be blended with the same quality as when they are painted in soft paste porcelain, as is the case for the cup. So that's probably why it looks a bit more schematic and less painterly, if you will. But I really like particularly the introduction of these gilt motifs by Leco, if I remember well, of reeds, which speak of the natural habitat of the duck that is being hunted. So if we move now with the saucer, it's also painted by Didier, but in this case, he's not taking direct inspiration from an oil sketch, so a colored composition. He's taken inspiration from a set of prints. Mia referred to the prints that Bachelier bought for Sèvres, and this is probably part of that set. And here, Gilles Lemarteau produces the print after Jean-Baptiste Huet with this composition of a dog barking at a squirrel. And Huet was another famous animal painter. He also painted pastoral compositions. He came from a lineage of animal painters, and his compositions were famously adapted to the cotton prints known as toile de Jouy. So what we see here is how, and this is probably a more detailed image to the left of the saucer, Didier is trying to adapt, or he adapts a print into a colored composition. And it was Sir Geoffrey de Bellaigue in his catalogue of Sèvres porcelain at the Royal Collection that he says that Didier is a good painter, but he is not of the first ranking painters at Sèvres when he compares him to Dodin. But I find that Didier is very good at copying. He beautifully copies the Deport oil sketch, and is in a very rich composition. And when he's copying this print, he still adapts to this technique. You can see the dog is painted in the saucer almost in a feathery way, as it would have been taken from the hatchings of the print. But he is less imaginative than other painters, especially when we look at the foreground and this sort of landscape that seems to be relatively schematic compared to other painters, such as Dodin. And Dodin has been dubbed as the most important, most accomplished painter at Sèvres. He spent all of his career at Sèvres. He has a very interesting career, and he was lauded even after his death by the Sèvres director. And he is much clever at adapting compositions after prints and paintings. Here he takes inspiration after Boucher in this print, but the dog that is accompanying this couple becomes a more lively pet, also decorated with a ribbon. It has more agency, and you can tell that there is an element of enjoyment in painting this dog. Although I have to say that when I was looking at this, I found quite interesting that many times when Dodin and also other painters are taking inspiration from prints and drawings and paintings, they seem to get rid of the dogs that appear. And here I have a couple of examples. When they look at these, when Dodin, here at the bottom in a vase, the Royal Collection, represents the Good Father, he decides not to include this dog here at the bottom, apart from other changes in the composition. And the same, the painter who has painted this different vase has decided not to include the dog in the composition. And then Dodin decides not to include this spaniel in this adapted composition for this vase ferré, probably because of the format, maybe because the dog is not essential for the narrative, whereas the sheep and the cow is more pertinent to talk about pastoral love, and there is no space to include a dog. I mean, this is just my hypothesis, but here you see how cleverly Dodin adapts to the composition, and he changes the leg of this figure to be able to sit well in that reserve. And then we see Asselin, for instance, that this quite prominent dog on the print of Le Marchand de Village, he decides not to include it, probably also again because of lack of space in his composition. But it's just interesting to see that they don't seem to include dogs if they can do so. And staying with Dodin, he was so well considered that he is the first painter that he is commissioned in 1760 to paint proper paintings. So what they refer to as tableaux, so these plaques that act as works of art in their own right, and that they were highly appreciated, also probably a way of conserving in a very stable media paintings that were painted on canvas or panel. And this plaque in the Met that may have belonged to Madame de Pompadour is a very clever composition after the Flemish painter Van Valens. And we know that this canvas was in the possession of the French Academy, so it may have been available to Dodin, who would have painted it. There was sometimes they would have taken inspiration from prints after paintings, but in this case, the fact that the positioning, the orientation, that's what I was trying to say, of the figures is the same, it tells us that Dodin was looking at the painting, although he is not following the same colors. And you see how Dodin very cleverly takes a figure from this painting and inserts him here, and is this attendant lacing collar around the dog. And then you see this lapdog leaping at this sitter. But Mia is going to tell us more with these beautiful examples at Waddesdon.
Yes, so the two boys on the right of the original painting have been isolated and turned into sort of standalone figure groups of boys and dogs on this pair of elephant vases at Waddesdon that are in the very rare petit vert colour. And they date from 1762. So next slide, please. But unlike in Dodin's plaque for Madame de Pompadour, on this vase at Waddesdon, Dodin has retained the original figures from the painting surrounding the seated lady. She no longer kind of reaches into thin air towards an unrelated group of boy and dog, but instead reaches for fruit proffered to her by an enslaved boy. She also has the same dog on her knee and the same dog to her left. But if you could move on, Felix, you can see the composition here with the plaque on the left, then the elephant vase with the same boy and dog, and then the vase Hébert that I've just shown. And move on again, please, Felix. So one of the most magnificent vases at Waddesdon is known as the Copenhagen vase because it was owned by the Moltke family in Copenhagen. And it's a large potpourri vase that takes the pendant to the Van Vallen's painting that we've just been looking at as its model. And in this case, we firmly believe that the painters at Sèvres had access to the painting rather than a print after the painting, because you can see how the colours match those in the painting. So the colours of the painting have faded slightly, but you can see that the lady is wearing a pink skirt and a yellow top with blue trim, that the attendant looking up and leading the other horse is wearing a red jacket. But I also like how Dodin has moved around, as Felix was saying earlier, the different figures of dogs from the painting. The dog drinking from the river on the left has now got his own cartouche on the left of the vase, and the dog that was by the horse's back legs has been moved further away and is in the cartouche on the right. So movable dogs. And back to you, Felix.
Yes, and we mentioned earlier the commission of tapestries to Oudry with the hand of Louis XV, and this was revisited later under Louis XVI when a commission of 9 plaques for the staggering price of 24,000 livres was made to Sèvres to decorate one of the rooms at Versailles. And of course, in this prestigious commission, Dodin makes an appearance, and we see these 2 plaques painted by Dodin. Here, I'm only showing 4 of the 9, but here it's a huge representation of dogs in different positions and different attitudes, hunting dogs, and you can get a sense of the royal pack, La Meute Royale, quite clearly. And what I find also quite interesting is that the compositions that were made for Louis XV are adapted, are updated for Louis XVI in the medium of porcelain. So whenever there is a portrait of Louis XV, a portrait of Louis XVI is inserted, and also the uniforms are updated. And I wanted to end my section with these 2 examples of dogs in Sèvres porcelain. Here, one of them is quite pertinent because this painting by Karl van Loo is in the Wallace collection. And here at the bottom, you see this dog listening to the concert that is given to the Grand Seigneur or the Sultan. And this painting was in the possession of the King of Poland by the time Dodin painted this plaque here in the middle to be inserted on a guéridon, on a round table. And so we know that he must have looked at the print that is here to the left, also because the sense of the composition is mirrored as that to the painting, and the colors are totally different. But keep in mind this dog that Dodin decides to include in this guéridon, that, by the way, it was made for another famous patron of Sèvres porcelain, Madame du Barry, because it will appear again in this porcelain plaque painted by Dodin after another composition. And this is quite interesting to see how designs go from medium to medium. The first design for this composition, that is known as the Hymen, or the Alliance, is by Louis-Simon Boiseau, working for Sèvres, a great sculptor, and he creates this biscuit group for the marriage of Louis XVI's younger brother, the Comte d'Artois, and in 1773. And then in 1774, the engraver Levasseur translates the 3D sculpture into 2 dimensions, and he needs to add a background, so he adds this neoclassical background, and he adds this beauty here holding the armorial devices. But when Dodin translates it into porcelain, he needs to add color to it. He is making it more generic of love, and not necessarily specific for the Artois marriage. So he gets rid of the devices, he adds beauty, he adds the turtle doves, and he adds a dog of fidelity. And Marie-Laure de Rochebrune has mentioned that this may be a rushed commission by Dodin that explains the high price that was paid for this painting, this plaque, 330 livres, and maybe the rushedness on it. There is a reason for Dodin to include a dog that is a flipped copy of something that he had already painted before. So let's end with Mia and some very fun furniture for dogs.
Yes, so last but by no means least, we have to consider the dog as a consumer of the decorative arts in 18th century France. So aristocratic and royal dogs had luxurious upholstered beds created by members of the Menuisier Guild. In some cases, they were carved, and in rare cases, they were even gilded. Madame de Pompadour had a dog bed with 3 compartments for her rooms at Versailles, one for each of the dogs that she had at that moment. And these dog beds were often upholstered on the top so that they could be sat on, as well as being a place to retreat in for a little dog, as visible in this Boilly painting, which is also at the Wallace, where all sorts of stuff is going on in the painting, but the dog is just peeking out of its little comfy dog bed, to which I'm sure it will be retreating once all the drama's over. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mia. That was wonderful. I don't know if we have any questions from the public.
Certainly. Thank you both for today's talk. A wonderful insight into, well, I never thought I'd see so many dogs in decorative arts hiding away there. We have had a question through on Zoom. Just a reminder to everyone at home, if you have any questions on YouTube, you can pop those in on the chat function. But Susanna has said, did the Sèvres artists ever sign their pieces, or is it known who the artist was based on manufacturing records only?
Yeah, Mia, do you want to reply to that one?
Yes, sorry. I would. It's known both from factory records, and each of the painters at Sèvres had a mark. They didn't necessarily sign, but they had a mark by which they were identified.
Fantastic, thank you. And a second question we've had is, can we see Mia's dog?
And this is a very grumpy Kiki, because I just woke her up and I can't reach Pixie, I'm afraid, who is sound asleep, bored, witless.
Well, I suppose a follow-up question would be, do they have their own dog bed and is it gilded?
Well, I'm working on it.
Fantastic. That's about all we have time for today as we come up to 2 o'clock. So all that's left for me to say is, of course, thank you to Felix and Mia for today's talk. And thank you to all of you who have joined us at home. We hope you've enjoyed today's talk, and please do catch on the recording on YouTube if you'd like to watch again. We look forward to welcoming you back online for more online talks from the Wallace Collection very soon. Good afternoon.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mia. It's been wonderful.
Thanks, Felix. Bye.